Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to chapter 2 of our Democracies at War lectures. We will today tackle a kind of second preliminary question: does regime type matter? And this question is deduced from the empirical statement, the empirical observation that we made at the very end of last week's lecture. We saw when looking at the evolution over time of the occurrence of wars, we saw that since the end of the Cold War, Western liberal democracies were involved in a fairly significant number of international wars, 7 more precisely, out of 19, that is to say more than one war out of 3. Now, to put forward this statement, to emphasize the fact that Western liberal democracies have been pretty bellicose, presupposes to establish a link between the domestic regime of a state, the internal political regime of a state, and its foreign policy behavior in general, and in our case more specifically, a link between the liberal democratic nature of Western powers regime on the one hand and their war-proneness on the international stage. When I use the term Western liberal democracies, ladies and gentlemen, I have in mind a somehow common sense, or at least a qualitative definition of democracy. Democracy, to use a metaphor, is a bit like an elephant. It's not easy to define, but we recognize a democracy when we see it. Why? Because there is a kind of consensus regarding the characteristics of a liberal democracy, which is characterized first by, or based first on a set of institutions, regular elections, plural elections, of course, separation of powers, independent press, private property, a free market economy, so a set of institutions, and beyond institutions and complementary to them, a set of human rights which are respected. The civil rights, of course, that is to say, the freedom of expression, of worship, of thought, of conscience. Political rights, the fact to participate in fair elections, democratic elections, and social and economic rights, the right to work, the right to get an education, to have social security, etc., etc. So we should, I think we can satisfy with this qualitative definition. I do not think that it's necessary for our purpose to resort to quantitative measures of a state's degree or of a state's level of democracy. This is what is proposed, for instance, by the so-called polity project, which has reached its stage number 5. Here is the homepage of the website concerned. The aim pursued by the polity project is a fairly academic or cognitive objective. This is not the case as regards the Freedom House think tank or the Freedom House NGO, whose objective is somehow normative, political, maybe we could say ideological. The two quantitative the conception of democracy are somehow similar. The polity project distinguishes the democracies from anarcracies, from autocracies, while the Freedom House think tank distinguishes free states from partly free states from non-free states. Anyway, these two projects emphasizing quantitative, the capacity to propose a quantitative measure of democracy is interested in comparing governments. This is not the case, so this is not the aim of my course. My the aim of my course is to study the concrete behavior of Western liberal democracies on the foreign political international scene in the domain of war and peace. And this is also why I will focus on major Western powers, for the very simple reason that we saw last week. A war is launched in order to impose one's will upon the target. So the fact of result of war presupposes, of course, that the state concerned is significantly powerful. Very last remark, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at the different wars that I highlighted on this list, I did not highlight the wars fought by Israel, which is a liberal democracy, which can be considered as a liberal democracy, maybe a Western liberal democracy anyway. Why didn't I include Israel's wars? Because I think they obey to different logic, since Israel is surrounded by neighbors which it perceives, rightly or wrongly, as threatening its existence. So the situation is radically different from the US, the UK, or France, the major Western liberal powers, who are not coping, who are not faced by existential threats since the end of the Cold War. Therefore, I focus exclusively on the US, the UK, and France. Why do I consider, ladies and gentlemen, the Western liberal democratic powers wars to be significant, to be interesting? Why, as a scholar, of course, do I consider these wars to be interesting? I think there are two reasons. A political or ethical or moral one on the one hand, and a more scientific or academic one on the other hand. First of all, a political reason. Western governments do not call their wars wars. They call them operations. They call them interventions. They call them sometimes even humanitarian interventions. And the reason of this kind of updated Orwellian newspeak is, of course, to be found in the Western liberal democracies' self-image as peace-loving nations, which goes back basically to Woodrow Wilson. We'll come back to this in our next chapter. Liberal democracies are proud of their self-image as peace-loving countries, and they do distinguish themselves from autocracies or dictatorships, which they accuse to be or stigmatize as aggressive, war-prone countries. Now, this self-image is belied, refuted by the statistics, since a significant number of international wars since the end of the Cold War do involve Western liberal powers. This gap, ladies and gentlemen, between the Western discourse, the official discourse, and the practice, the really existing practice, is politically, ideologically challenging, and it is ethically or morally disturbing, because it, of course, raises questions such as why do supposedly peace-loving democracies go to war? How can democracies claim to be peace-loving while waging a significant amount of wars? And what's more, how do they manage to maintain on the long run, over time, this image successfully as peace-loving countries, at least in the eyes or in the mind of their own public opinions, how they manage to do so while actually waging wars? Within our academic setting, of course, these questions form what I think we may call a scientific enigma or a scientific puzzle. And that is to say, a set of questions that deserve to be, that are looking for scientific explanations, and that deserve to be looked at through cognitive or theoretical lenses or looking glasses. I will therefore address these questions thanks to the knowledge provided by mainly international relations as a discipline, of course, war studies, philosophy or political theory, and history too, since history to some extent is underpinning the three other major disciplines. I am an international relations scholar, and therefore, basically, I will refer to theoretical frameworks and concepts proposed by the discipline of international relations, which then, maybe this is the question that you are asking, which theory will then underlie my analysis, the analysis that I will put forward throughout the next chapters. The answer here is not that self-evident, for the very simple reason that the majority of international relations theories, mainstream, but maybe even to some extent, all the more so, non-mainstream theories, radical theories, post-positivist theories, all the theories are somewhat uncomfortable when it comes to posit a link between a state's domestic regime and its foreign policy behavior. To sum up this point, on the one hand, the majority of theories do not postulate that there is a correlation, and all the less so a causal link between a state's domestic political regime, in our case democratic regime, and the foreign policy behavior of the states concerned in general, and its war-proneness in particular. There is only one exception, and we'll come back, of course, to the details. There is only one exception. This exception, which emphasizes which posits there is a link between the domestic regime, the democratic domestic regime, and the foreign policy behavior. This exception actually claims that this foreign policy behavior is peaceful and not war-prone. And on the other hand, the same theories, both those who deny there is a causal link and the exception which claims there is a link but a peaceful one, reintroduce, somehow contradicting themselves to some extent, they reintroduce some elements which are compatible with the idea that there is a link between the domestic regime and the foreign policy behavior, and regarding the exception that sometimes a democracy may be tempted to go to war. So in today's lecture, ladies and gentlemen, and therefore it's kind of preliminary chapter. In today's lecture, I will propose a kind of survey of all of the theories concerned, mainstream theories, before, in the last part of the last section of today's class, putting forward the framework which at least implicitly influences my own analysis, if I may use this expression. So let's have a look at the survey of the different theories concerned. If we start with, so it will be a chronological survey. If we start with the very beginning of the discipline, and if we, rightly or wrongly, neglect the first approach dominating during the interwar period, that is to say, the idealist approach of notably British scholars because of its openly normative perspective, the first major paradigm in the discipline of international relations was classical realism. Classical realism, notably embodied after World War II by the American author of German origin, Hans Morgenthau. Hans Morgenthau, in his Bible of Classical Realism, Politics Among Nations, the first edition was published in 1948, claims that when looking at how states behave on the international scene, he claims that every state is eager to defend and to promote its national interest, defined in terms of power. listen to Hans Morgenthau in the first introductory chapter of his Politics Among Nations, the main signpost that helps political realism, that is to say his approach, which he calls political realism, the main signpost that helps political realism to find its way through the landscape of international politics is the concept of interest defined in terms of power. The concept of interest, you could have said national interest, defined in terms of power. We assume, or Morgenthau assumes, I quote, that statesmen think and act in terms of interest defined as power. And history proves, according to him, the validity of this assumption. The national interests, I go on quoting, creates that astounding continuity. That astounding continuity, that astonishing, surprising continuity in foreign policy, which makes American, British, or Russian foreign policy appear as an intelligible, rational continuum. So there is a continuity in a state's foreign policy, whatever the statesman, and could we add whatever the regime, because he gives the example of Russia, 1948, Russia was no more Russia, but the Soviet Union. And he also emphasizes this point, national interest explains the continuity regardless of the different motives, preferences, and intellectual or moral qualities of successive statesmen. To put it differently, whatever a state's regime, autocratic or democratic, it always will promote its national interest. So the democratic regime or the non-democratic regime does not shape the foreign policy of a state. And in his book called In Defense of National Interest, published a bit later in 1951, this is what he wrote, page 34, all the successful statesmen of modern times, from Richelieu to Churchill, have made the national interest the ultimate standard of their policies, of their foreign policies. The national interest is what Richelieu, as well as Churchill and all statesmen in between, were looking to achieve. Richelieu, the prime minister of the French absolutist monarchy under Louis XIII during the 30 Years' War, Churchill, the prime minister of democratic Great Britain at the end of the 1930s during World War II. So no impact whatsoever of the domestic regime upon its foreign policy, according to Morgenthau. Why is this the case, according to him, and according to classical realism more generally? Well, because international politics, by definition, is power politics. And this goes back to his explanation at the roots of politics and even of society in general. We have human nature, and human nature did not change, has not changed since its laws were discovered by the philosophers, I quote, of ancient China, Greece, and India. What then does this nature consist in? You know it. It consists in biopsychological drives common to all men, the drive to live, to propagate, to dominate. And since states are aggregations of men, they behave like men. They try to dominate. They try to exert, and they actually look for exerting their power, for imposing their will upon other states. International politics is power politics. Foreign policy consists in defining, in satisfying, in promoting and defending a state's national interest defined in terms of power. The domestic regime, in other words, is not an explanatory variable. It does not explain how a state behaves on the international scene. It does not account for a state's war or a peace-proneness. Morgenthau's classical realism prevailed roughly up to the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, some 20 years or so before being criticized. Stage number 2 in my chronological survey, before being criticized by scholars adherent of the so-called behavioral revolution, which started in American social science, political science, and then international relations at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. Behaviorists, as indicated by their label, are interested in looking at the concrete behavior of political actors, in our case, a state or a statesman. That is to say, they reject Morgenthau's assumptions, which they consider to be metaphysical or at best philosophical assumptions, prejudgments, could we say. That is to say, they do not claim that politics is rooted in human nature. They do not posit that international politics, by definition, is power politics. They do not think that statesmen as such do think and act in terms of the national interest defined in terms of power. Very concretely, then, they ask, how do states behave? What do they do? What do statesmen do when they take this or that decision, when they undertake this or that action? That is to say, they gradually ended up replacing why questions by how questions. According to behaviorists in the domain of international relations or in the domain of foreign policy, to understand why a state decided to do this or that, we, international relations scholars, have to study how the decisions were made, the decisions at the origin of a state's behavior. And therefore, their approach in our domain of international relations is called foreign policy decision-making analysis. Foreign policy decision-making analysis. They rejected Morgenthau's rational actor model, the implicit rational actor model. A statesman pursues the national interest of his or her state on the basis of a state's relative power, etc., etc. They rejected this rational actor model, and they proposed somehow two alternative approaches. The first one is a sociological approach due to Graham Allison in his Essence of Decision. This is the second edition that you see on the slide. The first edition goes back to 1969. Graham Allison proposed two alternative models to the rational actor model, the so-called organizational model and the so-called bureaucratic or governmental model. According to the organizational model, a decision is the output of standard procedures of behavior of an administration, of an administration's organization. That is to say, the final decision of the statesman, of the policymaker, the American president, for instance, is the result of routine procedures within the administrations that form a government. The decision maker himself sitting on top of a set of organization, a constellation of organizations, and the decision is the output of all the information provided by the different organizations. So the statesman is somehow the prisoner of the established organization, and therefore a decision taken at a point in time t will be pretty similar to a decision taken at a point in time t-1, and it will be followed by a fairly similar decision taken at a point in time t+1. A statesman is prisoner of his administration, and he is also shaped, influenced by the different struggles among the different administrations, among the agencies forming the administration. This is the bureaucratic model. That is to say, an administration is composed by different agencies, ministries, departments, the advisors, also individual advisors of the final decision maker, who all try to promote their bureaucratic interest. That is to say, the different agencies or departments exert pressures. They establish log-rolling coalitions, two agencies against the third or against two other administrations, in order to convince the final decision maker that they should adopt their solution, their proposal, because it promotes the specific department's bureaucratic interests. And in this perspective, the decision then that is taken and the action that is undertaken is no more the output, but the outcome of the struggle among the different bureaucratic agencies, eager, each of one, to impose their will upon the final statesman's decision. Sociological constraints limit, to put it differently, and to sum up Allison's approach, the freedom of action of statesmen. And this model, Allison applied it and actually deduced it from his analysis of the concrete empirical case study of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In our perspective, this means that both the American decisions of the Kennedy administration and the Soviet decisions of Khrushchev's communist government were analyzed through the lenses of the bureaucratic and the organizational models. That is to say, no specificity of the American democratic government when compared to the Soviet autocratic or totalitarian governments. Democracy, in Allison's approach, is not a variable likely to explain what states do on the international scene. The same is true for the second behaviorist author, and I would like to have a very quick look at Robert Jervis, who proposed a psychological approach or a cognitive approach of decision-making, no more a sociological one. Jervis thinks that the statesman's rationality is limited by cognitive processes. And more specifically, he claims that statesmen, just as average people, such as you and me, are influenced by, or not influenced, but victims of misperceptions. That is to say, they do perceive the reality, the somehow objectively existing reality, not objectively, but they perceive it not as it is, to put it differently, but as they believe it is, or even as they would like it to be. On the basis of what? On the basis of their pre-established convictions, beliefs, ideas, which themselves go back to a statesman experiences as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult. These experiences, these psychological experiences, which formed a statesman personality. To put it differently, according to Jervis, a statesman, when looking at the reality, pretty often have an inaccurate, a wrong perception of other states' capacities, of other states' intentions, sometimes even of their own states' resources, etc., etc. And among the different case studies that he proposes in his perception and misperception of international politics, which was published in the mid of the 1970s, he gives as many examples of democratic leaders or policymakers within democratic settings, Chamberlain in Great Britain, or George Cannon, John Foster Dulles, Nixon, Eisenhower in the US, as many democratic examples as autocratic leaders, Hitler, Bismarck in Imperial Germany, and Stalin, of course, in totalitarian USSR. Once again, to put it differently, the democratic or the domestic regime in general is not a variable that Jervis things should be taken into account. Stage number 3 in our survey, Kenneth Waltz's Neo-Realism. Kenneth Waltz was influenced by the behaviorist criticisms against Morgenthau's classical realism. So his aim in the Theory of International Politics, the book published in 1979, his aim was to overcome these criticisms in order to save realism to some extent. So what does he concretely do? What did he concretely do in this book? He rejects Morgenthau's claim that human nature basically explains politics in general and international politics in particular. It is not human nature which explains it, and he agrees with behaviorists. And then he proposes his own explanation. International politics is explained, can be ascribed and should be ascribed to the anarchical structure of the international system, to the power configuration of the international system. And here he disagrees with the behaviorists because he looks at the systemic level of analysis, what he calls the third image, what he called the third image in his first book, Man, the State and War, rather than looking at the individual decision maker, either his psychological characteristics or the bureaucratic and organizational constraints, that is to say, the first and the second level of analysis, or the first and the second image, to quote Kenneth Waltz. So Kenneth Waltz claims that international politics is the basic explanatory variable. And more specifically, he starts saying that states are like units. Because of the anarchical structure of the international system, states are like units. What does that mean? States are like units. It means that states are incited by the anarchical setting within which international politics takes place. They are incited to perform the same actions. I quote, "Anarchy implies sameness." Of course, Waltz knows that states vary, I quote, widely in size, in wealth, in power, and in form. In form, we could say, regarding their domestic regime. But according to Waltz, I quote, "These variations are variations among like units." They are like units because, I quote, "they are alike in the tasks they face." And the major task that they face is to guarantee, to achieve, to keep their security. States are incited by the anarchical structure to look for their security. In anarchy, I quote, "Security is the highest end. Only if survival is assured can states safely seek other goals, such as tranquility, profit, or power." Power was the main goal, according to Morgenthau. It is now security in the neo-realist version of Waltz's realism. The goal, the system, the anarchical system encourages states to seek is security. All the states, whatever their size, their wealth, their power, or their political domestic regime, all states look for security. And in order to do so, they adopt a self-help policy. Listen to Waltz's Theory of International Politics, page 111. To achieve their objectives, that is to say, to maintain their security, units in a condition of anarchy, must rely upon the means that they can generate for themselves. Self-help. Self-help is necessarily the principle of action in an anarchic order. So states must, a performative verb, self-help necessarily deterministic adjective. So this indicates that there is no freedom of action. There is no choice left to states or to statesmen. The anarchical structure imposes self-help as the only rational behavior on the international scene. Foreign policy decisions are constrained by the anarchical structure. And very concretely, this means that states look for maintaining the balance of power. They prevent any other state from becoming too powerful, because if one state is too powerful, the other ones will feel threatened. That is to say, their security will no longer be guaranteed. So Kenneth Waltz, ladies and gentlemen, deduces the self-help behavior from the anarchical setting, that is to say, from factors located at the systemic level, his third image. And he does reject what he calls reductionist approaches. A reductionist approach consists in explaining international political outcomes by variables located within the domestic setting of states, as precisely is the case of Jervis or of Allison. He even ends up, to some extent, in no longer being interested in foreign policy, in concrete foreign policy actions. Listen to what he wrote in Theory of International Politics, page 121. The balance of power theory, his one, that is to say, self-help concretely consists in adopting a balance of power strategy. Balance of power theory is criticized, is often criticized, so he's aware of the limits of his approach, but he chose these limits. Balance of power theory is often criticized because it does not explain the particular policies, the very concrete foreign policy actions of states. True, so he admits this, true. The theory does not tell us what, the theory does not tell us why state X made a certain move last Tuesday. The very concrete action undertaken by a state last Tuesday is not what I, Kenneth Waltz, am interested in explaining. What I'm interested in explaining is the recurring outcomes on the international scene, the fact that regularly balances of powers do prevail. This permits me, Kenneth Waltz, to deduce that states look for establishing such balances of power, and they are incited to do so by the anarchical structure of international politics. So, to put it differently, to sum up Kenneth Waltz's neo-realist theory, he's not even interested in explaining concrete foreign policy actions such as wars, and therefore the democratic variable is somewhat off the point. It is irrelevant in his systemic approach. Kenneth Waltz's neo-realist theory was very successful in the 1980s. The book was published in 1979. It had enormous impact, and it somehow forced other scholars, at least other American scholars, to try to criticize his approach. This is the case of, so to criticize his approach while somehow accepting his postulates in order to be able to establish a dialogue, of course. That is to say, those who criticized him also abandoned the concrete analysis of foreign policy. They focused on international politics. This first is the case of Robert Keohane, who in 1984 published his After Hegemony, a Cooperation and Discord in the World Political Economy. Keohane is the most important representative of neoliberalism, sometimes called neoliberal institutionalism. And his aim was to explain why cooperation existed, despite Waltz's claim that states cannot but practice a self-help policy, which excludes, by definition, cooperation. If you adopt a self-help behavior, you cannot trust somebody else, or since you do not trust anybody else, you cannot cooperate, and therefore you must adopt a self-help policy. And according to Robert Keohane in his After Hegemony, the state's behavior is not due to the anarchical setting, but it is ascribable to the information which states possess. So if they are able to know what other states will do, they are likely to cooperate rather than adopting self-help behavior. So it is the systemic distribution of information which explains international politics and therefore cooperation. The second author replying to Kenneth Waltz, or eager to refute Kenneth Waltz, was Alexander Wendt. In his social theory of international politics, social theory is, of course, an allusion to theory of international politics. And in this social theory of international politics, or his constructivist soft or modernist constructivist theory of international politics, Alexander Wendt too is interested in international politics and not in foreign policy. Listen to Social Theory of International Politics, page 11, like Waltz, and he adopts this attitude in order, of course, to establish a dialogue with Waltz. Like Waltz, I'm interested in international politics, not in foreign policy. And you may know, of course, that according to Alexander Wendt's constructivist approach, a state's behavior depends on the anarchical culture within which states are embedded. Concretely, these anarchical cultures are of three kinds: the Hobbesian culture, the Lockean culture, and the Kantian culture. And the state's behavior in their mutual interaction depends on the shared identity, depending on whether they conceive of themselves as enemies, as rivals, or as friends. So neither in Wendt's constructivist approach, nor in Keohane's neoliberal approach is democracy considered to be an important variable. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, Moravcik's new liberal theory of international politics was also influenced by Kenneth Waltz's theory. Once again, the titles, or in this case, the subtitle of Moravcik's article, Taking Preferences Seriously, alludes directly to Waltz's original theory of international politics, since he calls it a liberal theory of international politics. A bit later, it was called new liberal theory. Anyway, the objective of Moravcik is to reject Waltz's top-down analysis or explanation of international politics by a bottom-up approach. That is to say, if you want to understand why states behave the way they behave on the international scene, we have to look at the domestic actor level of analysis, the collective actor level of analysis, that is to say, the domestic setting within the state. Moravcik more specifically starts from the assumption that the basic actors of politics in general, and therefore also of international politics, are not states, but individuals, rational and risk-averse individuals, whose aim is to satisfy their own private interest, their singular interest, both on the domestic political stage, but also on the international political scene. A state, therefore, is not a unitary actor, and it is not even an important, it's at best a secondary actor, because it is supposed to defend and to promote those interests, be they ideational or material, that individuals themselves cannot promote themselves in a more rational and somehow in a less costly way. So states are not unitary actors. There is no national interest. There are only particular interests. And within civil society, there are contending, competitive groups. And every group, composed by different individuals, tries to satisfy its own interests, which are not necessarily compatible with other groups. interests. So what do they concretely do? Well, they try to exert some pressure upon the final decision maker in order for this decision maker to pursue a policy which satisfies their specific societal interests rather than the interests of other groups. So decision making, therefore, according to Moravcsik, according to Andrew Moravcsik, decision making in domestic politics, but also in foreign policy, is constrained by the underlying interests and powers of the different groups, of the different individuals acting individually, or more specifically within groups, of course, to be more efficient. They have an interest in forming groups, pressure groups, political parties, unions, associations of different kinds, lobbies, etc., etc. So the foreign policy of a state, therefore, is not a continuous, coherent undertaking, as in Morgenthau's approach, or even in Walz's approach. It does not consist in promoting the national interest, which does not exist. It merely consists in a series of particular decisions reflecting the different interests of those groups that managed to influence the decision maker's final decision. In order to know which groups are likely to exert a successful pressure upon the governments, what does Moravcsik do? Well, he looks at the domestic regime. Why? Because it is, of course, through a state's political domestic institutions that this influence of private groups or specific groups is channeled. To put it differently, the political regime of a state is the crucial variable which explains why a state is acting the way it is acting on the international scene, according to Andrew Moravcsik. The political regime is the crucial variable determining a state's foreign policy. So states are not like units, as claimed by Kenneth Walz. They are constrained by different groups. And the groups that are successful sometimes are no longer necessarily successful in other contexts. States are not like units, they are actually functionally differentiated. They will adopt different behaviors according to the different groups that are likely to exert a successful pressure. To put it differently, democratic regimes do not behave like autocratic regimes, which do not behave like totalitarian regimes, etc., etc. Which amounts to saying, ladies and gentlemen, that Moravcik's approach does acknowledge a state's democratic regime to be the explaining variable of a democratic state's foreign policy behavior. So he's then the exception among grand theories, which establishes a causal link between domestic regimes, in our case, a domestic democratic regime, and the foreign policy behavior. However, and this is problematic, since he claims that individuals, which by definition form the majority in a democracy, are rational and risk-averse individuals, he comes to the conclusion that a democracy should be peaceful, because it is in times of peace that the majority of rational, risk-averse individuals are likely to satisfy their interests, and not in wars. So the link that Moravcsik establishes between democracy and foreign policy behavior consists in saying that democracies, because of their democratic regime, are likely to behave peacefully. And his approach, to some extent, is shared positively and negatively. Positively by Bruce Rosset in his Grasping Democratic Peace. We'll come back to this book next week. And negatively by Jessica Weeks, who analyzes the tendency of dictators to go to war. So according to Moravcsik, democracies should behave peacefully. That said, he recognizes that there may be exceptions to this rule. That is to say, sometimes democracies go to war, and more specifically, when within a democracy, one specific group, which has an interest in a war being waged, manages to bypass the majority of rational risk-averse individuals in order to exert a successful pressure upon the government, leading this government to wage a war which will satisfy the private, sinister, specific, and we could call them sinister interests of the group or the groups, the minority groups concerned. And according to Moravcsik, this is at the origin of what he calls to be imperial or imperialist wars fought for the satisfaction of a specific minority of societal groups. We will use this approach when analyzing Operation Iraqi Freedom in our chapter 4. For today's lecture, this exceptional case, this deviant case of war-prone democracies when they launch imperialist wars is significant. Why? Because all the other theorists that we mentioned, with the exception of the behaviorists, do also recognize some exceptions to their rule, which consists in saying that there is no link between a democratic regime and its foreign political behavior. That is to say, the grand theories that we saw do indirectly, implicitly reintroduce some elements which recognize democracy as a variable. It is true first of Alexander Wendt's social constructivist theory. Why? Because the example that he gives of a Kantian anarchy is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is composed by democratic member states. So indirectly, he acknowledges that democracies are likely to share values that explain why they form a security community and a collective security system, that is to say, an anarchical, a Kantian anarchy. In Kioin's neoliberal theory too, democracy is somehow indirectly reintroduced. Why? Because when claiming that states do cooperate with one another, the example that he gives is the cooperation in the domain of economy, in the domain of trade, in the domain of finance, the example of the IMF, of the General Agreement on Terrorism and Trade, of the World Bank, now the members, when he wrote his book in the 1980s, of said institutions, of said organizations, sharing information and thus permitting or facilitating cooperation. These member states were Western democracies. So once again, we have implicitly democracy as contributing to explain the behavior of states. The same is true even for Waltz and for Morgenthau, though their grand theory, as we saw, excludes democracy as an explaining variable. Waltz, after rejecting what he considers to be reductionist approaches explaining the foreign policy of a state by domestic variables, admits that the concrete foreign policy actions that he is not interested in looking at, that he is not interested in accounting for, he admits that these concrete foreign policy actions are also partly ascribable to domestic elements, to domestic variables, such as the political regime of a state. This is what he acknowledges in his reply to his criticisms, to his critics, Neorealism and its Critics, a book that was published, edited and published by Keohane in 1986, which includes criticisms of Kenneth Waltz's theory and, of course, his reply to his critics. And this is what he says in this reply. In the self-help system, state behavior varies more with differences of power than with differences of ideology or in governmental form. This is his major claim. self-help is due to the anarchical setting. In self-help systems, the pressures of competition weigh more heavily than ideological preferences or internal political pressures, the ones that Moravcsik will focus on. But after saying that, he recognizes that if one is interested in explaining very concrete foreign policy actions, if one is interested in explaining why state acts undertook this or that action last Tuesday, to quote him again, he recognizes that, well, one has to study, I quote, how the different internal structures of states affect their external policies and actions. So internal structures of democracies may have a different impact upon the foreign policy of democracies than internal structures of autocracies may have on the foreign policy behavior of autocracies. So he admits indirectly that when one is interested in explaining foreign policy, which he's not interested in doing, then we have to look at the regime and therefore also at the democratic nature of a state. The same is true for Morgenthau. Morgenthau, after explaining that the foreign policy of a state consists in satisfying the national interest, nevertheless knows or comes to the awareness, accepts that sometimes the statesman's rationality is biased. Notably, he says, in democracies, because the statesman must take into account the public opinion, which exerts some pressure, some control upon the foreign policy decisions and actions of the statesman, whose rationality, therefore, is somehow limited. Page 7 of his Politics Among Nations: when foreign policy is conducted under the conditions of democratic control, democratic regime, the need to marshal popular emotions to the support of foreign policy cannot fail but to impair the rationality of foreign policy itself. That is to say, in a democratic state, the decisions that a statesman takes are not always the best because of the negative impact of the public opinion, according to realists, classical realists such as Morgenthau. This goes back to Machiavelli. Average people, ladies and gentlemen, do not know what international politics is all about. So when they exert pressure, it is a negative impact and not a positive one. And therefore, Morgenthau comes to the conclusion that statesmen should not listen to the public opinion, but sometimes they have to because of the democratic control. So he also then, to some extent, reintroduces democratic variables. To sum up, ladies and gentlemen, this pretty long survey of the different theories when wondering whether the domestic regime, and more specifically the democratic regime, has an impact upon the foreign policy of a state. To sum up this pretty long survey, we can say that the majority of IR theories, at least mainstream IR theories, do not consider a state's democratic regime to be an important, a significant variable. And when they do recognize this, they come to the conclusion that democracies should behave peacefully. At best, they accept exceptions to the rule according to which the democratic regime does not impact the state's foreign behavior, but they do not. They are not interested in going further. That is to say, they are not interested in analyzing concretely how the democratic element could nevertheless have some importance in a state's foreign policy behavior. Ladies and gentlemen, if we come back to the statements, the empirical statements of the post-Cold War world, 7 wars out of 19 are waged by democracies. This is more than an exception. 1 war out of 3 being waged by liberal democracies, and the majority of them are initiated by democracies. I cannot help from thinking that we cannot use mainstream theories. We cannot even satisfy with the idea that, or start from the assumption that they could be assumptions, they could be exceptions to the general rule. These 7 wars out of 19 are more than deviant cases or contingent deviations, to quote Morgenthau. The question then is the following one: can we go beyond the theories that we saw? Is there nevertheless maybe one major grand theory which could permit us to account for these wars to be significant of democracy's foreign policy behavior? Can we go beyond the idea that democratic wars are either mere exceptions to the democracy's peace-proneness, or they are due to the state's behavior in general, whatever their domestic regime? I think we can. Why? Because, or thanks to a new approach, the neoclassical realist theory. I said some minutes ago that in the discipline of international relations, Kenneth Waltz's impact was enormous. He incited Keohane to criticize him, Wendt, and Moravcsik. Within the realist approach, his impact was more ambiguous. On the one hand, everybody, all the next generation of realist scholars, accepted his claim that human nature, Morgenthau's explanation, is no longer a valid explanation. We cannot think that foreign policy is due to human nature, for the very simple reason that human nature indeed is always the same. But states sometimes go to war and sometimes do not go to war. So we cannot ascribe both peace and war to human nature, because the two behaviors are contradictory, of course. So they agree with Waltz in saying that if we should look for a basic explanation, this basic explanation is located in the anarchical setting of the international stage, the anarchical structure of the international system. So they agreed with Waltz, but they were not very happy with Waltz's decision to no longer analyze concrete foreign policy decision, to only look at regular occurrences on the systemic level, what Waltz calls international politics. They were interested, the younger generation of realists, they were interested in explaining why state acts undertook this or that decision last Tuesday. So they tried to combine Waltz's neo-realism with Morgenthau's and other classical realists' approach, and they even went as far as taking into account other criticisms from behaviorist scholars and from liberal approaches. And in doing so, they proposed what will be called the neoclassical realist approach. The term was coined in 1998 by Gideon Rose in the review article published by the journal World Politics, Neoclassical Realism and Theories of Foreign Policy. The most important contemporary representatives of this approach are the two Americans, Lobel and Taliaferro, and the Canadian Norrin Ripson. So what is the specificity of neoclassical realism? They claim that a state's foreign policy, a behavior, and therefore, in our case, the decisions to go to war, are shaped first by an independent variable, which is located at the systemic level of analysis, but that it is also shaped, this foreign policy, by intervening variables located at the individual level of analysis and at the collective actor level of analysis. That is to say, according to neoclassical realists, a state's behavior on the international scene, and therefore its concrete actions, is driven first and foremost by a state's relative power, that is to say, by its position within the distribution of power resources, within the configuration of powers. This is the independent variable. However, the impact of this systemic variable, the transmission belt, is indirect upon the dependent variable, that is to say, upon the foreign policy actions. Why? Because it is filtered through, first, the statesman perception of this international structure. How does the statesman perceive the relative power of their state compared to the relative power resources of other states? And second intervening variable, the systemic structure is filtered by the capacity of the statesman to extract resources from the civil society in order to wage the policy that the statesmen, are eager to wage. That is to say, we could put it differently, it is also shaped by the capacity of the statesman to resist the different groups that try to impose their will upon and their interests upon the final decision maker's final decision. To put it differently, the neoclassical realist approach combines Kenneth Waltz's neo-realist approach with Jervis's theory of perception. There is a really existing, objectively existing systemic distribution of power resources, but the statesman perceives it, and it is this perception which is important, and he may be wrong, of course. And the statesman, as claimed by Moravcsik, has to cope with internal pressures. So depending on his capacity to resist or not, the foreign policy may be different. So a kind of eclectic, synthetic approach, but, and this is why I do appreciate it, it establishes a hierarchy between the three variables. There is an independent variable, the most important one. A state basically acts on the basis of its power resources compared to the power resources of another state. And the other variables are important, but they are secondary. Therefore, they are called intervening. They are less important. The perception is less important than the really existing reality. And the capacity to resist is also less important than the major objective power distribution. So this is the neoclassical realist approach, which somehow updates an analysis that had been put forward 2 generations earlier by the French Raymond Aron in his Peace and War. Raymond Aron was somehow, chronologically speaking, between Morgenthau and Waltz, and I cannot help from thinking that in his critique of Morgenthau, he somehow anticipated a Kenneth Waltz. That is to say, regarding our problem here, he also claims that foreign policy actions of states are shaped both by systemic and by unit level variables. According to Peace and War of Raymond Aron, it is first the distribution of forces, the configuration of the relation of forces which characterizes the international system and which therefore will shape the state's behavior. He agrees with Waltz, but somehow he anticipates Waltz. But he immediately specifies that the configuration of forces, the international system's structure, to put it differently, the number of powers that are existing, is one of the causes that determine the behavior of states. To put it differently, there are other causes, and these other causes somehow are close to the intervening variables of the neoclassical realists. Listen to Raymond Aron, page 92. The conduct of states towards one another is not controlled by the relation of forces alone, though this is the most important factor. Ideas and emotions influence the decisions of the actors. Ideas, the statesman's ideas. Emotions, the statesman's psychological characteristics. I think so. He then says that the national interest Morgenthau's famous national interest, cannot be defined apart from the internal regime. So the domestic regime, in our case, the democratic regimes, contributes to the definition of the national interest, which the statement then pursues on the international scene. The national interest cannot be defined apart from the international regime, the political ideal of the state. A democracy, an autocracy, a revolutionary regime, a military regime have different ideals and therefore will pursue at least partly different foreign policy. The national interest is not reducible to private interests, So he is opposed to Moravchik, who claims that private interests impose their will, or at least some private interests. He comes close to the neoclassical realists, claiming that it is possible, and at least it is positive, when statesmen resist a private interest, when they define the national interest independently from private interests. Why is this the case? The national interest is not reducible to private interest because leaders must know that security and greatness of the state must be the objectives of the diplomatic method. Greatness and security must be the objectives of the diplomatic man, whatever their ideology, democratic or autocratic. So what then are the objectives that states pursue statesmen according to Raymond Aron? First, security. Listen to Raymond Aron. In the state of nature, in the state of anarchy, the expressions are synonymous. Every entity makes security a primary objective. So he agrees with Walls. But second objective, collective units seek to be strong. They seek to be strong in order to be powerful. That is to say, capable of imposing their wills upon their neighbors and rivals. Morgenthau. The national interest is defined in terms of power. And then he adds a third variable. I would add, I claim, I quote, I would add a third term, not merely security and power, but also glory. States or statesmen look for glory. The desire for absolute victory, notably in war, is often more the expression of a desire for glory than of a desire for a power. Security, power, and glory are the three objectives. Security, he agrees with Walls. Power, he agrees with Morgenthau. Glory is Raymond Aron's added element to a realist approach. If we compare Raymond Aron to the American neoclassical realists, or the North American neoclassical realists, they agree upon the systemic configuration of powers as the crucial or independent variable. A state's foreign policy is first and foremost shaped by its relative power, relative to the other powers' resources. They agree upon the impact of first image and second image of individual level and collective actor level factors, but they have a somehow, or at least a slightly different conception of a statesman's freedom to act on the international scene. As you say, their conception of the famous agent structure controversy or debate is a bit different. Neoclassical realists, I think, have a more deterministic conception of this link between the agent and the structure. That is to say, they think that the statesman is constrained by the psychological limits. He cannot do what he wants because of these cognitive processes. They agree with Jervis. And also, they claim that a statesman doesn't always have the capacity to impose its will upon private actors. He's not always likely to extract the resources that he would like to achieve what he is interested in achieving on the international scene. Aron has a more individualistic approach of the individual or the agent structure debate, that is to say, more voluntarist conception of statesmen considered to be eager and somewhat able to shape international relations according to their vision of what international relations should consist in. That is to say, he considers statesmen to be able to resist to pressure groups within the state. And I think that this difference probably is due to the political context. Raymond Aron is a French author. In France, the executive power, ever since the French monarchy, the absolutist monarchy, Napoleon's empire, and the Fifth Republic, are known for acknowledging a very significant priority to the executive power, as expressed in the expressions domaine réservé and monarchie nucléaire, France, Fifth Republic, nuclear monarch or nuclear monarchy, because of the power of the French president to decide when to go to war, and even more specifically when to push on the nuclear button. Things are different in the US, where pressure groups are recognized as relevant actors in domestic politics, but also on in foreign policy. In foreign policy, the American president has been called the imperial president. We come back to this, but sometimes this imperial president is the spokesperson of a specific private group. So the importance of societal preferences is more acknowledged by neoclassical realists. Nevertheless, I would say that these differences between the neoclassical realists on the one hand and Raymond Aron on the other are more a difference of degree than of a kind. What does that mean? This means that I think we can apply, combine their two models to our topic here. And if we do so, we can, I feel free to posit the three following hypotheses. Regarding the independent variable, if nowadays the Western liberal democratic powers, the US, the UK, France, have been able to wage a significant amount of wars, it is thanks to the unipolar structure of the post-Cold War international system. Liberal wars, liberal crusades are possible. Why? Because the security of the US is guaranteed. The US has no major power to cope with. This is an idea notably put forward by John Mearsheimer in his last book, The Great Delusion. And regarding France and the UK, they bandwagon with the US. Their security is not at stake, and they behave like the US, as the US most important allies in the domain of war and peace. Regarding now the intervening variables, given that for some 3 decades now, the system has been clearly unipolar, there is no risk of misperception. That is to say, the perception of statesmen, the system is unipolar, ends up meaning what Aron considered as the possibility for a statesman to pursue the policy that they are eager to pursue in accordance with their vision of world politics. That is to say, Western statesmen are eager, are free to launch wars in order to spread liberal democratic values, which would increase the glory of their country and their own prestige, or their own reputation, and basically their own glory. They are free, to put it differently, to wage the new holy democratic wars, to use the expression proposed by the American philosopher Christopher Cutts. And regarding the second intervening variable, the existence of pressure group, which might theoretically speaking, in the neoclassical realist approach, prevent a statesman from doing what they are eager to do? Well, once again, this intervening variable does not exist, or more specifically, it contributes to the wars. Why? Because, as shown by Stephen Walt in his The Hell of Good Intentions, the civil society, and more specifically, the pressure groups outside and within, not to be the US administration, but the same is true in the UK and in France, are favorable to these wars. There is a kind of shared ideology according to which these wars are both the best means to promote the states and the group's own interests, and the states or some groups' ideational interest, that is to say, values or principles or ideologies. To put it differently, ladies and gentlemen, if I put myself in the mind of our statesmen who, during 3 decades now, have been considering war as an option on the international scene, I think that they somehow came to the 3 following conclusions. Yes, we can fight these wars because our security is guaranteed and no one can prevent us from resorting to weapons. Yes, we can. Yes, we want to fight these wars because they permit us to spread our values, and these values are the best. Yes, we will fight these wars because we are not the only one to be eager to do so. We are encouraged to do so by the civil society, by the media, by the different groups, part of the elite, the foreign policy elite in the US, in France, in the UK. Ladies and gentlemen, in acting this way, our Western liberal major powers do behave like past similar democratic or liberal powers, or maybe should I say Western powers, if we agree in establishing a kind of parallel between the contemporary Western liberal powers and past Western powers. 4 examples, or 3 at least. Athens became imperialistic. Once its security was guaranteed, it was eager to impose its will upon the rest of the Greek city-states, thus launching the Peloponnesian War. It had resisted successfully Persia, the Persian Empire, the Persian barbarian, and then it became offensive. The same is true for Rome. The Roman Empire successfully, the Roman Republic, successfully defeated its major opponent in the Mediterranean zone, in the Mediterranean era, Carthago. And once it got rid of its main opponent, the Roman Republic transformed into the Roman Empire, conquering the rest of Europe, North Africa, the Middle East. For example, France, the French Revolution, democratic, compared, of course, to the French absolutist monarchy, successfully resisted to the wars that were launched against it by the Austrians, by the Austrian Habsburgs, by different entities or princes of the Holy Roman Empire. And once successful, France, revolutionary France, became Napoleon's France, and Napoleon started the wars to create the Napoleonic Empire. And the United States, ladies and gentlemen, after surviving Pearl Harbor, after winning World War II, definitely abandoned its isolationist tradition based, according to its self-image, on the different values that were America's values. And it became, after World War II, the self-proclaimed policeman of the world, containing communism. And since the end of the Cold War, it became the liberal hegemon, spreading liberal values thanks to its liberal crusades, the wars that we are interested in analyzing. So we will focus logically on these wars from next chapter onwards. And we will begin next week with a general presentation of these wars, which I consider to be constitutive of what has been called the dark side of democratic peace. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending today's lecture. I wish you a great day, and I hope you'll be back in a week. Goodbye.